They polished her hair until it shone like glass and dressed her in linen heavier than a child should carry. The veil smelled of lavender and candle wax. The castle hummed with voices that were really calculations. Outside, winter teeth at the slate. Inside, torches bent light across banners and tapestries. In a cold chamber somewhere in France, a girl was being readied not for a wedding, but for the sealing of a treaty. Her name was Isabelle. They called her a princess and wrapped her in splendid trappings, but the title masked the truth. She was a human hinge in a design of power. The king who waited below was nearly 30 and hollowed by grief. King Richard, who had mourned a previous queen as though the whole realm wore black with him. His loss was a wound his council wanted to stitch into a bargain. Peace, not mourning, mattered, so crowns bargained with flesh. This marriage was not private. It was a political instrument that required a body to testify. Ink and seal were not enough. The union had to be consummated and witnessed until no rival could plausibly call the contract a sham. To erase doubt, the ritual stretched. The wedding night became a week-long process in a public, clinical verification where medicine, theology, and statecraft conspired to remove uncertainty by removing privacy. They led the child to the chamber like a procession of legal evidence. Guards took stations. Clergy and physicians moved on fixed schedules. Servants replaced linen and reheated food. Twice a day, learned men, physicians who wrote in Latin and charts, inspected, recorded, and certified. Each entry in the ledger read like proof. Pleasure was not a possibility. It was a data point to be checked. Where we would call it brutality, contemporaries called it procedure. Medieval minds believed in humors, in astrological timing, in rituals that tied the body to political legitimacy. Physicians argued that conception needed repetition, that a woman's humors must be balanced and pleasure encouraged, so the experiment demanded repetition. A royal marriage that produced no heirs was a legal vulnerability. Annulment could be argued. Alliances unraveled. The stakes were dynastic, immediate, absolute. Isabelle was only a child. The texts you can find in dusty ledgers and clerical chronicles do not hesitate to list processes while failing to reckon with the person who endured them. Chroniclers tell us dates and attendees. They record the presence of physicians and the 7-day verification. They do not describe a girl's hands trembling under linen. They do not tell you what it does to a mind to have its first nights watched and graded. The sources are careful and cold. The silence in them is what screams. For 7 long days she lived under observation. Men in learning watched for signs, wrote in the margins, and added their notes to the official record. They timed the acts according to charts. They measured, they observed, they certified. When Isabelle flinched, they logged it. When she cried, they said a prayer and carried on. When she bled, they entered it into the record as evidence. The language of science turned into the language of proof. Outside the chamber, messengers took news like supplies to be rationed. Damp, precise letters went back to Paris and Westminster reporting completion or failure. To the governments they represented, these were facts of state. To the girl who returned pale and silent after a week, they were injuries, legal and otherwise, that no physician's ointment could soothe. She did not conceive. Her body would not, or could not yet, answer the demands of policy. The marriage, for all its ceremony and calculation, could not be made fertile by procedure alone. What remained, however, was the mark of what had been done. Afterwards, Richard treated her as a ward, a royal ornament. They never produced an heir. When later events unseated kings and reshaped alliances, she would be sent back to France, still young, still bearing the invisible claims of that enforced week. History records that she was later remarried and bore children. The surface settles into its tidy facts, but underneath those facts are invisible scars. The claim a crown made on a child's body, the way a nation's fragility can be diagnosed across the flesh of its youngest people. The ledger may close the story with a line about succession. The human record is a ledger of absences, of songs unsung, of nights that belonged to no one. This practice on the extended bedding, public verification, appears in multiple courtly documents, medical treatises, and legal records of the period. In each, the same pattern emerges. When dynastic stakes are high, systems develop to de-risk the political investment. The methods are clinical: witnesses, physicians, schedules, entries. The logic is brutal but rational in its own terms. Compassion in those terms is an impediment. We must read those records with two muscles: intellectual clarity and humane attention. The documents tell us what officials thought necessary. They do not, by design, ask whether a child should be asked to prove a treaty with her body. That question is for our century to ask, and to answer differently. When you tell this story, do not let your imagination fill the silence with lurid invention. Let the silence demand our attention. Let the cold, precise details of the archival notes speak for the policy that made a child an instrument. Let the child, Isabelle, stand in the center of your story, not as a footnote in a treaty, but as a person whose life was shaped by choices made in council chambers and banquet halls. Power learns to convert hope and law into instruments. Empires knit themselves with vows and verify them with bodies. That is the lesson of a week in a bedchamber. Not a scandal contained in centuries past, but a question about the human cost of political certainty that echoes across the ages. Listen for the ledger's quiet. Read the names that appear in the margins, and above all, remember the small things that survive paper. A pale face emerging into light, a veil folded away, a story returned home years later in a hush. Those fragile traces are the proof the archives often omit, the proof that policy leaves people behind.